the evidence for Tupac Shakur's case has finally been unsealed. This evidence had been collected, sealed, and locked away while time and rumors flew by. Most people believed nothing new would ever surface. Finally, police reopened a long-forgotten evidence box tied to the case. Inside were items and records that investigators had known about, but the public never had. The unsealing opened wounds and files that had been closed for so long. What was hidden inside that box for 27 years? The box that never went away. Detective Brent Becker had spent nearly 3 decades working homicide cases in Las Vegas, but there was one file that never quite left his mind. It sat in the evidence room at Metro Police headquarters, waiting patiently on an equally patient shelf. Around it were thousands of other cases, some solved and others still lingering in filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. But this one was different. This one had a name that the whole world knew. The evidence room itself was a quiet place where time moved slowly. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting everything in a pale white glow that made the concrete walls look even colder than they really were. Dust particles floated through the air like tiny spirits, and most of the shelves hadn't been disturbed in so long that you could trace patterns in the dust with your finger. Row after row of sealed containers stretched into the distance, each one holding pieces of stories that had stopped being told. Becker walked past these silent witnesses to history until he found it. The container was plain and unremarkable at first glance, nothing that would catch your eye or make you think it contained anything important. But the label told a different story. Written in careful letters were the words Shakur, Tupac Amaru, followed by the year 1996. Those numbers and that name had hung over Las Vegas like a cloud for nearly 27 years. That night had started like any other night in the city. But around midnight, everything changed. A white Cadillac pulled up alongside a dark green sedan on Flamingo Road, one of the busiest streets cutting through the heart of Las Vegas. What happened in those next few seconds sent shockwaves through music, culture, and the entire country. A shooting that lasted only moments, but whose echo would never be forgotten. The immediate aftermath had been pure chaos. Police sirens wailed through the night air. Officers raced to the scene. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Hospitals filled with activity. Detectives worked through the darkness, trying to piece together what had happened. But the answers never came. The years turned into decades, and the case remained open, waiting. The box in front of Becker now held the physical evidence from that night. Inside were documents carefully organized by other investigators who had come before him. Chain of custody labels showed every person who had ever touched these materials. Every time the box had been moved from one location to another. Every time it had been locked away and then unlocked again. The paperwork itself was thick, yellowed in places, recording the details of that September night in clinical language. There were photographs, reports, and evidence logs. All of it carefully preserved, waiting for someone to look deeper. There was nothing flashy or dramatic about the container. It was just evidence, but what made it different from all the other containers in this room was what it represented. It was unfinished business, a promise made long ago that someone would keep searching, keep trying, until the truth finally emerged from the silence. Becker looked at the sealed edges, at the tape that held it shut, at the official stamps and signatures that marked its journey through time. He had authorization to open it. The investigation was being revived. After all these years of waiting on a shelf gathering dust, this box was finally going to be examined again, with fresh eyes and renewed determination. He reached out and began to lift the lid. As it slowly rose, the weight of 27 years seemed to press down on everything in that quiet room. There were no answers revealed in that first moment, no sudden solutions waiting inside, just the beginning of a story that had been paused for far too long, finally ready to continue. What the police couldn't prove. The detectives who arrived on Flamingo Road that night were experienced men and women who had seen violence before. They knew what they were looking at. Within hours of the shooting, patterns began to emerge from witness statements and intelligence reports that sat in filing cabinets and on desk notepads. The pieces were there, scattered like a puzzle that investigators could see the outline of, but could never quite assemble into something solid enough to take to court. Tupac Amaru Shakur had been a man of contradictions. To the world, he was a force of nature. His voice boomed from speakers in cars and homes across America. You would hear him speaking about struggle and injustice and the realities of life in poor neighborhoods. He gave interviews where his words burned with conviction. He made movies where he commanded the screen. He wore his emotions on his sleeve and made no apologies for it. He was unafraid to say what he believed, even when it made powerful people uncomfortable. That was the public image, the one that had made him famous and beloved by millions. Law enforcement saw something else in their files and reports. They saw a young man caught in a world of gang affiliations and street rivalries that went far deeper than music. Intelligence reports mentioned names that belonged to organizations operating in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. The Southside Compton Crips appeared in these documents with frequency. There were notes about tensions, about disputes, about the kind of conflicts that in that world could only end one way. One name kept appearing in the margins of these reports: Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson. He was connected to the Crips, young and volatile, the kind of person who could become important in an investigation if someone could make the pieces fit. Investigators wondered about him. They asked questions about him. They looked for connections between him and that white Cadillac. But wanting to know something and being able to prove it in a courtroom were two very different things. The problem was fundamental and frustrating. Witnesses had seen something that night on Flamingo Road, but they weren't talking. Fear ran deep in neighborhoods where gang violence was common. People understood that cooperating with police could mean putting targets on their own backs. Retaliation was not just a word in these communities. Mothers told their sons not to speak to police. Friends warned friends that talking could get them in danger. The code of the street was older and more powerful than the law, and everyone knew it. Without witnesses willing to testify, without someone brave enough to step forward and say what they had seen, the investigation stalled. Physical evidence from the scene told part of the story, but not enough. A weapon could be traced if investigators could find it, but the firearm had disappeared into the night like smoke. Bullets and shell casings could point to a direction, but they could not point to a shooter. The forensics told detectives that a crime had happened, but not who had pulled the trigger. Tupac himself had known something was coming. In interviews from those final months, his words carried a weight that was hard to ignore. He spoke about paranoia, about looking over his shoulder, about feeling betrayed by people he thought he could trust. He talked about the violence surrounding him like it was a tide rising. He seemed aware, in some way that was difficult to articulate, that his life was moving towards something inevitable. His lyrics from that period were dark, introspective, filled with references to death and danger. He was shouting warnings into the void, and very few people were really listening. Finally, he became a victim of his own prophecy, and the detectives were left behind, unable to bring the truth of that night to light. Until this moment. But what really happened? The confession that sat in plain sight. Among the documents that Detective Becker carefully removed from the unsealed container was a series of transcripts that read like a confession written in invisible ink. The words were all there, clear and detailed, speaking to events on that September night with a specificity that only someone present could have known. For years, these statements had been locked away under an agreement that made them nearly useless to prosecutors. They were truths that the law had decided not to use, knowledge that had to be kept secret, information that sat in plain sight while justice remained out of reach. The man whose voice filled these transcripts was Dwayne Keefe D. Davis. He was a figure who existed in that murky space between the street and the system. Someone connected to gang life, but also someone who understood the value of making deals with law enforcement. Years before police would eventually arrest him, Davis had already told investigators much of what they needed to know. He had walked into conversations with law enforcement and voluntarily described his involvement in the events surrounding the shooting. He had named names. He had explained motives. He had described where people were positioned. He had provided details that went far beyond what could be found in any witness statement. But there was a catch, and it was a crucial one. Davis had spoken under what was called a proffer agreement, a tool that prosecutors sometimes use when they want information from someone who might have committed a crime. The agreement worked like a bargain. Davis would tell the truth about what he knew, and in exchange, the government promised not to use his own words directly against him in court. It was a way to get information without immediately pressing charges. The logic behind these agreements made sense in theory. Prosecutors wanted to know what had happened. They needed details to understand the full scope of events. But they also understood that without these agreements, most people involved in serious crimes would simply stay silent. A proffer agreement created an incentive. It said, Tell us what you know, and we won't use your confession to put you in prison, at least not for the statements you make here. Davis had believed that this protection was permanent. He had spoken freely, almost casually, describing his role in events that had shocked the nation. He provided names with a confidence that suggested he believed those names would stay buried in government files forever. He described motivations and actions with the kind of detail that comes only from someone who was truly there. Unfortunately for Davis, this agreement had an expiry date. They could protect someone for years, even decades, but the protection had limits. Prosecutors could use the information that Davis provided to pursue other leads, to build cases against other people. They just could not use Davis's own words as evidence against him in court. It was a technical distinction, but one that mattered enormously. As the years passed and the investigation remained open but dormant, Davis lived with the knowledge that he had confessed to his involvement, but also with the belief that he had confessed safely. The transcript stayed in the evidence room, locked away, part of a file that seemed to have become a historical artifact rather than an active investigation. Witnesses passed away or moved away. Memories faded. The case grew colder with each passing year. Davis perhaps began to believe that he had actually gotten away with it, that the machinery of justice had simply ground to a halt and would never start again. But there was always that clock ticking, even if no one could hear it. The agreements that protected Davis were based on circumstances that did not remain static forever. New leads could emerge. New evidence could be discovered. The legal landscape could shift. Prosecutors could find ways to use the information Davis had provided without relying on his own confession. They could build a case from other sources that pointed to the same truth Davis had already admitted. And when that moment came, when the machinery finally did start moving again, those transcripts would no longer be a safe harbor, but a roadmap showing exactly where the truth had been hiding all along. The search that reopened the past. In September 2023, more than 27 years after that night on Flamingo Road, a team of Las Vegas Metro Police detectives stood outside a house in Henderson, Nevada, with a search warrant in their hands. The house belonged to someone connected to Keith D., and inside its walls were materials that might finally break the silence that had protected secrets for nearly 3 decades. The detectives were not looking for one magical piece of evidence that would solve everything. The officers moved through the rooms with purpose, cataloging everything they found according to procedures that had been refined over years of similar investigations. They were searching for digital traces. A computer sitting on a desk became part of the evidence chain. Hard drives were carefully removed and sealed. Mobile phones were placed into evidence bags with labels noting the date and time of seizure. The inventory that would later be filed in court showed the systematic nature of what was taken from that house. Everything was photographed, from photographs to documents, and inventoried. What was not found was equally significant. There was no firearm. There was no smoking weapon retrieved from a closet or buried in a yard or hidden away waiting to be discovered. The cinematic moment that movies and television shows had trained people to expect, the dramatic revelation of the weapon itself, never came. The real value of what was seized lay in how these materials could corroborate what Keith D. had already admitted. The computers and phones held digital records that could align with timelines he had described. The photographs might show people or vehicles or locations that matched his earlier statements. The written documents could support claims he had made about communications and plans. Together, these little pieces of evidence would reveal the truth. Modern investigations work differently than the investigations of previous generations. A single fingerprint or a single eyewitness used to be enough to make a case stand up in court. But in the 21st century, investigators understood that strength came from convergence. The search warrant execution itself was a signal that the investigation had fundamentally changed status. It was no longer a cold case that was reopened only when someone had time to think about it. It was an active investigation with resources devoted to it. The search at the Henderson house was not a wild shot in the dark. It was a calculated move based on years of analysis and legal strategy. As the detectives worked through that house, taking inventory of computers and phones and documents, they were essentially retrieving the past from where it had been hidden. The materials they seized were not necessarily new information. Much of what they would find had probably already been told to investigators in earlier interviews and confessions. But now that information would exist in a form that could be used in court corroborated by physical evidence and digital records rather than just by the word of a witness who had made a deal to avoid prosecution. The past was no longer something that could remain buried. It was documented in devices and photographs and written records. The search in Henderson was the moment when investigators finally had the tools they needed to turn confession into conviction. The machinery of justice, which had seemed to stall for so long, was moving forward at last, when the evidence became public. The Clark County Courthouse sits in downtown Las Vegas, a building where thousands of cases move through the system every year. In the fall of 2023, one particular file began to move through the machinery of the legal system in a way that would eventually make it impossible for the case to remain private. The process started quietly. Motions were filed by prosecutors. Defense attorneys responded with their own documents. The back and forth of legal arguments, the technical language of criminal procedure, the careful construction of arguments about what could be disclosed and what should remain sealed, all of it began to accumulate in the court file. Each document added to the official record, and with each addition, the boundary between what was secret and what was public began to shift. As the legal process unfolded, the boundaries between sealed and unsealed began to shift. Judges made rulings about what portions of the file could be revealed to the public. The sealed inventories that had been filed away under protective orders began to be released in redacted or partial form. Journalists started showing up at the courthouse with their notebooks and cameras. Legal observers and analysts began to examine what was becoming visible. The public inventory showed the scope of what had been seized. The listings were straightforward and factual, without commentary or interpretation. But even without explanation, the inventories told a story. They showed that investigators had taken materials that could be cross-referenced with statements that had been made years earlier. The unsealing did not provide every answer, but it removed the possibility of claiming that nothing had happened, that the case was truly dormant, that investigators were grasping at straws. Evidence was not the same as proof. The items that had been seized could be presented in court, but presenting them was different from proving beyond a reasonable doubt that they established guilt. So, the unsealing of the evidence did not mean that the case was solved. It meant that the evidence could now be examined and challenged and tested in the open, under the scrutiny of defense attorneys and judges and, eventually, possibly a jury. The fact that the evidence was no longer sealed changed something fundamental about the case. When the inventories were hidden, they could be dismissed or forgotten or doubted by people who wanted to believe that the investigation was not really going anywhere. But now that the materials were part of the public record, now that anyone could walk into the courthouse and request copies of the inventories, the case had a different kind of reality. The machinery of justice was on the move again, and the hope for discovering the truth grew brighter. Tupac's family and the cost of waiting. Tupac Shakur was a mother, an activist, and a believer in justice and truth. She had raised her son Tupac in an environment where fighting for what was right was not optional, but essential. She had taught him to speak up, to question, to refuse to accept injustice quietly. And then, on a night in September 1996, everything that she had taught him and everything that she believed in was tested in the most painful way imaginable. The years that followed were not like the years before. A mother who loses a child to violence does not simply move forward, she carries that loss every single day. Afeni fought for answers with the same intensity that she had brought to everything else in her life. She demanded that investigators do their jobs. She pushed for accountability. She refused to let her son's case be forgotten in the way that so many other cases involving young black men were forgotten. Year after year passed without resolution. Afeni watched as the investigation seemed to stall, as leads went nowhere, as the case seemed to become less urgent with each passing season. She watched as other cases were solved while hers remained open. She lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to fully accept what had happened because the full truth remained hidden. The emotional weight of unresolved justice is not something that is often discussed in the context of high-profile cases. People think about the investigation. They think about the evidence. They think about whether the case will be solved. But they do not always think about the family members who carry the weight of not knowing, day after day, year after year. For Afeni, every anniversary of Tupac's death brought the grief back fresh. Every news story about unsolved cases reminded her that her own son's case remained in that limbo. Afeni managed her son's estate. She preserved his music, his art, and his legacy. She worked to ensure that his voice continued to be heard, that his words and his ideas did not disappear simply because he was no longer alive to speak them. As hard as she tried, Afeni could only honor her son's memory, but she could not give him what every parent wants to give their child, which is safety, justice, and a future. The unsealing of the evidence in 2023 came decades after Tupac's death. Afeni Shakur was no longer alive to see it. She had passed away in 2016, having never received the answers that she had demanded for so long. The investigation that finally moved forward after all those years came too late for her to experience the resolution that she had fought for. Her son's case became active again, but she was not there to witness it. She would not see the charges filed. She would not see the court proceedings. She would not know, finally, whether justice would be served. The good part? The fight that she had waged had not been in vain. Even if she did not live to see it vindicated, the cost of waiting 27 years for justice testifies to her right and honors her final wishes for her son. What changed and what didn't? For a very long time, the suspicions that investigators held had remained just that, suspicions locked away in files and protected by agreements that prevented their use in court. Now those suspicions could be confirmed. The materials that had been recovered could be examined openly. The connections that investigators had suspected could be tested in a courtroom under the rules of evidence and the scrutiny of defense attorneys. The unsealing had also enabled prosecution where prosecution had previously been impossible. Keith D. could be charged not just based on his own confession, which was protected by a proffer agreement, but on evidence that corroborated what he had said. The computer files and written documents and photographs could establish timelines and relationships in ways that did not depend on his own testimony. Perhaps most importantly, the unsealing reframed the entire narrative. For nearly 3 decades, the case had existed in a kind of fog. Was there genuine evidence, or just theories and speculation? The mystery had been as much about why nothing was happening as it had been about what had happened on that September night. But the public unsealing of evidence changed that story. It transformed the narrative from an unsolved mystery into a story of accountability that was finally being pursued. But there was another side to this accounting, one that required acknowledging what had not changed and what could not be changed, no matter what evidence was unsealed or what charges were filed. Tupac Shakur was still gone. The bullet that had been fired on Flamingo Road 27 years earlier had taken a life that could not be restored. No amount of evidence, no matter how compelling, could bring him back. The decade in which Tupac had lived and created and influenced culture could not be rewritten. His music would always stand as the work of someone whose life was cut short. His legacy would always be incomplete in the way that the legacies of all young people who leave the stage before their time are incomplete. The history of that era, the cultural moment that he had been part of, could not be revised simply because evidence had finally been unsealed. What had happened had happened. The only thing that had changed was finally knowing the details of exactly how it had happened and who had been responsible. Some questions, despite all the evidence that had been recovered and all the investigation that had been done, would still remain unanswered. Not all mysteries are solved, not all details emerge, even when a case is thoroughly investigated. The human mind holds secrets that are sometimes never fully revealed. Motivations that seem clear from one perspective might look different from another. Conversations that were not recorded were gone forever. The complete picture of every moment and every thought and every decision that led to the events of that night might never be fully known. Even with all the evidence in the world, the gravity of this realization settled over the case like dust. Justice, when it finally came weighted with the knowledge of how long it had taken to arrive. The unsealing of evidence was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of acknowledgement. It acknowledged that a system had failed to deliver justice in a timely way. It acknowledged that a family had waited nearly 3 decades for answers that should have come much sooner. It acknowledged that even when justice finally arrives, it cannot undo the damage that was done by its absence. The evidence box was sealed again, but this time, not by the dust of neglect or the weight of bureaucratic indifference. It was sealed by the process of the court, by the rules of evidence that governed how these materials could be used and preserved. The contents of that box would be presented in court. They would be examined and challenged and tested. They would become part of a trial record that would exist in the official history of the case. The materials that had been hidden would now be part of the permanent public record of what happened on that night. The case had changed. The investigation had changed. The narrative had changed. But the fundamental truth remained the same. A young man had passed away. His death had gone without accountability for far too long. And now, finally, after nearly 3 decades of waiting, the system was moving toward a reckoning. It was not the swift justice that should have come immediately. It was justice delayed by years and decades. But delayed justice, when it finally arrives, carries with it the weight of all that time, a reminder that the machinery of the law moves slowly and that some costs can never be fully repaid.